Behind the gilded doors of Madrid's royal palace, a secret was unfolding that would eventually destroy one of Europe's oldest monarchies. While diplomats discussed trade agreements and generals planned military campaigns, Queen Isabel II of Spain was orchestrating a different kind of conquest that would scandal an entire continent and ultimately cost her the throne. Picture this: a woman with absolute power over 25 million people, unlimited access to the national treasury, and an appetite for romance that knew no bounds. For more than 2 decades, Isabel transformed the Spanish court into a theater of passion, where military promotions were earned in bedchambers, where opera singers became aristocrats overnight, and where the line between political favor and sexual indulgence disappeared entirely. But how does a 3-year-old girl, crowned amid national celebration and hope, become the protagonist of scandals so outrageous they would make even the most libertine French courtiers blush? The answer lies in a toxic combination of absolute power, moral neglect, and a childhood that prepared her for everything except the responsibility that came with ruling an empire. Isabel's story begins in 1830, born to King Ferdinand VII and his 4th wife, Maria Cristina of Bourbon II, Sicilies. Her arrival disappointed a court desperately hoping for a male heir, but Ferdinand, who had married 4 times in his desperate quest for a son, decided his daughter would have to suffice. This decision would prove catastrophic for Spain's future. When Ferdinand died in 1833, 3-year-old Isabel inherited not just a crown, but a civil war. The First Carlist War erupted, immediately pitting supporters of the child queen against those backing her uncle Carlos, who claimed superior rights to the throne. For 7 years, Spain bled while Isabel grew up, surrounded by armed guards, paranoid courtiers, and an atmosphere where violence and political intrigue were daily realities. During these formative years, Isabel received an education that would shape her disastrous future. Courtiers desperate to curry favor with the future monarch told her she was the center of the Spanish universe, that her desires were sacred, and that anyone in the kingdom should be willing to die for her happiness. They created a monster of narcissism and hedonism, who never learned the concepts of limits, responsibility, or consequences. Even more disturbing was Isabel's early exposure to adult sexuality. Ambitious courtiers, many of them unscrupulous men, seeking influence, frequently discussed intimate matters in the young queen's presence, believing she was too young to understand. This premature exposure to adult sexuality, combined with the complete absence of moral education, planted seeds of obsession that would dominate her entire life. In 1843, at just 13 years old, Isabel was declared of age and officially assumed the Spanish throne. This premature political decision was taken to end the turbulent regency of her mother, but it placed an emotionally unstable teenager in command of one of Europe's most important countries. The young queen, physically developed for her age, but emotionally immature, suddenly discovered she possessed absolute power over millions of people. The first warning signs appeared during negotiations for the royal marriage. Isabel had developed an alarming sexual precocity and showed explicit interest in men much older than herself. At 14, she was already openly flirting with generals and ministers' behavior that scandalized even the most libertine courtiers. When European diplomats discussed potential husbands for the young queen, their conversations were dominated not by political considerations, but by speculation about how to control the evidently insatiable sexual appetites of the Spanish monarch. The final choice fell on her cousin Francisco de Assis, Duke of Cadiz, in a decision that proved catastrophic both politically and personally. Francisco was a weak, effeminate man who, according to persistent court rumors, was homosexual. The marriage, celebrated in 1846 when Isabel was 16, was a farce from the very first moment. The sexual incompatibility between the spouses was so evident, it became a topic of conversation in every European court. The wedding night was, according to accounts from ladies, in waiting a complete disaster. Francisco, terrified by Isabel's dominant personality and possibly repelled by the very idea of intimacy with a woman, was unable to consummate the marriage. Isabel, already sexually awakened and with expectations fed by years of explicit conversations at court, was left frustrated and humiliated. This traumatic experience created a resentment that would push her toward a life of increasingly scandalous infidelities. In the months following the marriage, Isabel began seeking sexual satisfaction outside matrimony. Her first documented adventure was with a young officer of the Royal Guard named José María González, known by the nickname Pepe Alcañices. This relationship, which began in 1847, established a pattern that would repeat throughout her entire reign. Isabel would choose men of inferior social position, shower them with privileges and titles, but eventually grow tired and replace them with new favorites. Alcañices was a handsome man, but of humble origin, the son of an army sergeant. Isabel, fascinated by his virile masculinity in contrast to her husband's femininity, rapidly promoted him through military ranks and granted him privileges that caused scandal at court. He received extravagant gifts from the royal treasury, including jewels, properties, and sums of money equivalent to the annual budget of entire cities. Even more scandalous was the fact that Isabel made no effort to hide the relationship. Alcañices appeared publicly alongside the Queen at official ceremonies, accompanied her on royal trips, and had free access to the palace's private quarters at any hour of day or night. This lack of discretion scandalized foreign diplomats who sent detailed reports about the Spanish Queen's behavior to their respective capitals. The relationship with Alcañices lasted approximately 3 years, during which Isabel became pregnant at least twice. The children born from these unions were officially attributed to King Francisco in a legal fiction that fooled no one at court. When Isabel tired of Alcañices, his dismissal was as sudden as his elevation had been. The ex-favorite was transferred to a distant military post and subsequently exiled from the country, receiving a generous pension in exchange for his silence. About the intimate details of his relationship with the Queen, this brutality in discarding lovers would become a constant characteristic of Isabel's behavior. Isabel's next favorite was even more scandalous: Carlos Marfori, an Italian actor and opera singer who arrived in Madrid in 1851. Marfori, exceptionally handsome with a magnificent voice and a stage presence that immediately fascinated. The Queen was particularly shocking because he was married and had children, but Isabel showed no shame in stealing another woman's husband. Isabel's obsession with Marfori reached levels bordering on madness. She attended all his operatic performances, frequently occupying the royal box alone and applauding so enthusiastically she embarrassed the entire court. After presentations, Marfori was escorted directly to the royal quarters, where he remained until dawn. These nocturnal visits were known throughout the palace, including by the unfortunate husband, Francisco, who was forced to publicly accept the humiliation of being cuckolded. During the relationship with Marfori, Isabel spent fortunes from the national treasury financing elaborate operatic productions specifically to showcase her lover's talents. She built a private theater in the palace, hired the best musicians in Europe, and imported luxurious scenery from Italy, all to create an environment where she could display her favorite. These exorbitant expenses occurred at a time when Spain faced serious economic difficulties and the Spanish people suffered under heavy taxes and occasional food shortages. The relationship with Marfori was also marked by intense jealousy and arguments that did not go unnoticed at court. Isabel developed a sickly possessiveness toward the singer, forbidding him to speak with other women and demanding he spend all his free time in her company. When she discovered that Marfori was exchanging letters with his wife in Italy, Isabel had violent confrontations that scandalized the courtiers present. During the 5 years that Marfori dominated the Queen's attention, he accumulated an enormous fortune through royal gifts and lucrative contracts arranged by Isabel. She granted him the title of Marquis of Loja and extensive properties in Andalusia, causing protests from the traditional nobility who saw a foreign actor being elevated above families that had served the Spanish crown for centuries. The end of the relationship with Marfori came in typical fashion for Isabel, sudden and cruel. In 1856, she simply lost interest in the singer and ordered him to leave Madrid immediately. Marfori, who had become accustomed to the luxury and power his position granted him, attempted to resist the dismissal, but quickly discovered that Isabel could be as ruthless as she was generous. He was escorted out of the country by royal guards and forbidden to return to Spain under penalty of imprisonment. The next chapter in Isabel's love life was even more scandalous and politically dangerous. In 1857, she began a relationship with General Enrique Puigmolto, a charismatic military man who had distinguished himself in the African colonial wars. Puigmolto was different from Isabel's previous lovers because he was a man with serious political ambitions who saw his relationship with the Queen as an opportunity to achieve real power in Spain. The relationship with Puigmolto marked a new phase in the moral degradation of the Spanish court. The general was not merely interested in personal gifts and privileges, but in using his influence over Isabel to shape national politics. He began interfering in military appointments, promoting his allies and removing officers he considered obstacles to his ambitions. This politicization of sexual favoritism created instability in the Spanish army and contributed to several minor military revolts. Even more disturbing was the fact that Puigmolto encouraged Isabel to expand her amorous activities even further. He introduced other men into the royal quarters, organizing encounters that included not only himself, but also other selected military officers. Among these was Colonel Miguel Tenorio, a decorated cavalry officer whose striking appearance and battlefield prowess had caught the general's attention. Tenorio, initially reluctant to participate in what he considered degrading to military honor, eventually succumbed to the promise of rapid advancement and substantial financial rewards. Within months, he rose from colonel to brigadier general, acquiring vast estates in Valencia and a personal fortune that rivaled established aristocratic families. These intimate gatherings, which occurred regularly in the royal palace, transformed the official residence of the Spanish monarchy into an environment where political favors were negotiated through sexual favors. The encounters organized by Puigmolto were elaborate events requiring extensive preparation. Special quarters were decorated with oriental furniture, participants received luxurious clothing, and musicians were hired to provide entertainment during the festivities. The costs of these extravagances were paid directly by the national treasury at a time when Spanish soldiers were fighting in colonial wars without adequate equipment, and public officials frequently went months without salary. During this period, Isabel's behavior came to include excesses with alcohol and growing emotional instability. She developed episodes of deep melancholy, alternating with periods of manic euphoria behaviors that seriously affected her capacity to govern effectively. Ministers reported growing difficulties in obtaining coherent decisions from the Queen, who frequently changed her mind drastically from one day to the next. The combination of constant amorous scandals, extravagant spending, and neglect of governmental responsibilities created an atmosphere in the royal palace that horrified foreign visitors. Ambassadors sent discreet but alarming reports about the state of the Spanish court, describing situations that seemed more appropriate for a brothel than for the residence of a Christian queen. These reports circulated through European courts, completely destroying Spain's international prestige. The situation deteriorated even further when Isabel began choosing lovers from among officers, courtiers, and people of lower classes, scandalizing the court that witnessed sudden promotions of men favored by the Queen. Royal guards of humble origin, suddenly received noble titles. Common merchants were appointed to important governmental positions, and minor artists became influential advisors through their intimate services to the monarch. This system of promotion based on sexual favors created an artificial aristocracy that completely despised merit and tradition. Noble families that had served the crown for centuries found themselves surpassed by new rich whose only talent was sexually pleasing the queen. This inversion of traditional values caused deep resentment among the established nobility and contributed to the erosion of aristocratic support for the regime. The royal residence seemed to function as an unofficial harem, with constant circulation of favorites who received titles, positions, and riches as they pleased the monarch. Dozens of young men maintained some type of relationship with Isabel, creating constant competition for her attention and favor. Among the most notorious was Antonio de Orleans, a distant relative who leveraged his royal blood to secure a place in Isabel's bed and subsequently in her government. Orleans, sophisticated and multilingual, served as her unofficial foreign minister, while simultaneously managing her personal finances, skimming substantial percentages for himself. Another was Captain Fernando Muñoz, ironically the son of her mother's secret husband, who used his family connection to become one of Isabel's most trusted confidants and regular lovers. The psychological complexity of these relationships, where family ties intertwined with sexual liaisons and political machinations, created a web of dependencies that made rational governance virtually impossible. This situation generated complex intrigues, where rivals attempted to sabotage each other to maintain or conquer royal preference. The existence of this network of favorites became known throughout Spain through servants who sold information to scandalous pamphlets. These pamphlets, which circulated clandestinely through Madrid and other major cities, contained detailed descriptions of the Queen's amorous activities that deeply shocked a conservative society. The Catholic Church, traditionally allied with the monarchy, found itself in an impossible position when attempting to defend a queen whose behavior violated all Christian moral precepts. During this period, Isabel also developed an obsession with exotic luxuries that incorporated elements from different cultures. She imported Oriental furniture, hired foreign consultants for elaborate redecorations, and transformed palace quarters into fantastic scenarios for her amorous encounters. These activities required enormous expenses in special decorations, clothing, perfumes, and other accessories imported from the most distant parts of the world. Isabel's obsession with novelties and luxuries became so intense that she spent more time organizing intimate encounters and elaborate parties than governing the country. Ministers frequently waited days to obtain audiences with the Queen, who was too busy with her lovers to worry about state affairs. This neglect of governmental responsibilities contributed to a series of political and economic crises that seriously weakened Spain's position in Europe. Isabel's physical decline also became evident during this period. Constant alcohol abuse, combined with an excessive sexual life and the emotional stress of constant scandals, affected her health in ways visible to anyone who encountered her. She developed tremors in her hands, her skin became pale and marked, and her voice acquired a hoarse quality that reflected years of excess. During the decade of 1860, Isabel's reputation had become so toxic that Spanish politicians began secretly discussing the possibility of her removal from the throne. Respected generals refused to serve under a queen who had become synonymous with moral scandal. Foreign diplomats avoided official visits to Madrid to avoid being associated with the controversial regime. Even traditional allies of the monarchy began publicly questioning whether Spain needed a change of leadership. The scandals became so public they caused indignation in Madrid, and the provinces frequently reflected in satirical pamphlets and verbal protests in the streets. The Spanish population, traditionally respectful of royal authority, began openly expressing their contempt for a queen who seemed to dedicate more energy to her personal pleasures than to her subjects' problems. The situation reached a critical point during the Revolution of 1868, when a coalition of military men, politicians, and common citizens rose against Isabel. Although this revolution had complex political and economic causes, the emotional catalyst was generalized moral indignation about the Queen's behavior. Revolutionary pamphlets portrayed Isabel as a woman who had prostituted not only herself, but the entire dignity of the Spanish nation. The revolt began with a military pronouncement in Cadiz, led by Admiral Juan Bautista Topete, but quickly spread throughout Spain as military units and civilian populations joined the movement. The battle cry of the revolutionaries was, "Down with the obscene one," a direct reference to Isabel's sexual scandals that had become synonymous with her public identity. When news of the revolution reached Madrid, Isabel initially attempted to resist using her favorites as military advisors. This decision proved catastrophic, since men chosen for their amorous abilities proved completely inadequate for dealing with a military and political crisis. Their attempts to organize a defense of the capital were so incompetent they accelerated the regime's collapse. In September 1868, when it became clear her position was unsustainable, Isabel was forced to abdicate and flee into exile. In France, her departure was marked by scenes of public humiliation when populations of cities she passed through shouted insults and demonstrated their contempt. The woman who had been crowned in an atmosphere of national hope left the country, hated by practically all her subjects. Isabel's exile in France was financed by treasures she had accumulated during her reign, including jewels and artworks she had appropriated to finance her excesses. She established residence in Paris, where she continued living a life of luxury, but now without the resources of the Spanish treasury to sustain her extravagances. During her exile, Isabel attempted several times to return to Spanish power, but her attempts were frustrated not only by political opposition, but by the moral repulsion her person inspired. Even traditional monarchists who theoretically supported the principle of royalty refused to work to restore a woman whose reputation had become synonymous with scandal. Spain, liberated from Isabel's presence, went through a period of political experimentation that included a constitutional monarchy with an imported king, a brief republic, and eventually a monarchical restoration under Isabel's son, Alfonso XII. However, the damage caused by Isabel's reign to the Spanish monarchy's reputation was lasting and contributed to the political instability that characterized Spain for the following 50 years. The moral trauma inflicted on Spanish society by her reign created a deep cynicism about authority that would manifest in the country's turbulent 20th century. Intellectuals and writers of the generation that followed would reference the Isabel years as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, while foreign observers continued to use her reign as an example of Latin decadence. Even today, historians debate whether Spain's delayed modernization and persistent political instability can be partially traced to the institutional damage caused by her scandalous rule. Isabel died in exile in Paris in 1904, a forgotten and despised woman who had destroyed one of Europe's oldest monarchies through her inability to control her amorous appetites and maintain royal dignity. Her death was minimally reported in the Spanish press, and even her own children showed little mourning for a mother who had embarrassed not only her family, but the entire country. The legacy of Isabel II of Spain serves as one of history's most extreme examples of how personal corruption can destroy entire political institutions. Her transformation from an innocent child into a figure synonymous with scandal illustrates how absolute power, when combined with lack of moral education and responsibility, can produce leaders who cause immeasurable damage not only to themselves, but to entire societies.